The house had grown quieter in the months since Evelyn passed, but the silence no longer felt sharp. It settled over the rooms like a blanket, gentle and heavy, stitched with the sound of clocks and distant traffic. Lila had begun to think of it as the way the house breathed now, slow and steady, waiting to see what she would do with all the memories left inside its walls. On that afternoon in late autumn, she stood in the hallway with a hammer in one hand and a frame in the other. Sunlight poured through the tall window at the end of the corridor, catching dust in the air and turning it into a soft golden haze. She had decided to turn this hallway into a small gallery of her grandmother's life, a place where visitors could see Evelyn the way Lila remembered her, not just as an old woman in a rocking chair, but as a girl who once laughed under foreign skies and a young bride who once believed time was on her side. She hung the first frame carefully, a photograph of Evelyn and Henry on their wedding day. Their smiles were bright, their hands joined, the world still unwritten in front of them. Next to it, she hung a picture of Evelyn holding baby Lila, eyes crinkled in that familiar way that always made Lila feel safe. Each frame found its place like a piece of a puzzle sliding into position. When she reached for the next one, the frame slipped from her fingers. It hit the wall with a dull crack, then dropped to the floor face down. Lila flinched at the sound. For a moment, she just stared, afraid to see how much damage she had done. The house fell completely silent, as if it too were holding its breath. She set the hammer down and knelt to pick up the frame. The glass had cracked in a jagged line across the surface, but it had not shattered. Carefully, she lifted the backing, planning to replace the glass later. That was when she saw it. Something thin and pale was tucked between the photograph and the cardboard backing. A folded piece of paper, the edges browned with age. Her fingers went cold. She slid the paper free and turned it over. There was no name on the front, no address, no stamp, just a single sentence written in slanted ink that time had tried but failed to erase. You deserved the truth. The words seemed to hang in the air between her and the empty hallway. Lila read them again, slower this time, as if a different meaning might appear. You deserved the truth. Her heart gave a small, unsteady kick. The paper smelled faintly of dust and something older, like dried flowers pressed too long between the pages of a book. She unfolded it with care. Inside, the ink had bled in places, but the handwriting was still there, patient and waiting. She did not read the rest, not yet. Instead, she looked back at the photograph that had been inside the frame. It was one she had seen before, but never paid much attention to. Evelyn standing near a stone wall, wind tugging at her hair, a hint of a smile on her lips. Beside her was a man in uniform. Not Henry. He was a little taller, his jaw sharper, his expression quieter. The caption on the back, written in Evelyn's familiar hand, had always puzzled her. It was just one letter, M. Now, standing in the golden light of the hallway with the letter in her hand, that single letter felt less like a mystery and more like the start of a confession that had been waiting for decades. Lila folded the paper again, more gently this time, as if it might bruise. The silence around her no longer felt like a blanket. It felt like a pause before a story resumed. She slipped the letter into her pocket and looked down the hallway lined with half-finished memories. For the first time, she wondered how many of her grandmother's stories had been edited by time, smoothed at the edges, trimmed of their harder truths. You deserved the truth. Maybe this letter was not just written for Evelyn. Maybe some part of it had been waiting for her too. If this beginning has touched your heart, remember to like, share, and subscribe to Voice of Lila's, where memories whisper and hearts remember. That night, the house refused to rest. The rain began after dusk, falling in soft patterns against the window panes. a steady rhythm that reminded Lila of how Evelyn used to hum while folding laundry. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter lying in front of her, the paper a pale island against the dark wood. The handwriting drew her in. It was neat but hesitant, the strokes slightly uneven, as though written by someone unsure if the words should exist at all. It didn't match her grandmother's tidy loops or her grandfather's steady cursive. Lila traced the letters with her finger, whispering the words under her breath. "You deserved the truth." She turned the paper toward the light and tried to read further. Most of the ink had faded, blurred into the fibers of the page. She could make out fragments, a sentence here and there. "I carried his words home. I should have told you then." The rest was a ghost of language, shadows of regret left behind. Her chest tightened. She pushed back her chair and went to the small writing desk near the window. Evelyn's journals were stacked neatly there, tied with a thin ribbon. Lila untied it and opened the top one, flipping through pages filled with recipes, dates, and brief notes about weather and daily chores. Near the middle, she found a single entry written in a different tone. "He came back alone." The words sat alone on the page, nothing before them, nothing after. Lila stared at them until her eyes blurred. Who had come back alone? And from where? Her mind flashed to the music box, to the note she had found months ago tucked inside its gears. "If you ever hear this again, I found the letter. M." Her pulse quickened. M. The same letter written beneath the photograph. The same letter that had hovered over Evelyn's story like a shadow no one wanted to name. She went to the shelf and pulled out a small tin box where she had kept the note from the music box. The paper had yellowed more since she last touched it, but the ink was the same deep violet. She placed the two notes side by side. The handwriting matched perfectly. So the man who had written, "You deserved the truth," was the same man who had written, "If you ever hear this again, I found the letter." Michael Turner. The name had surfaced once in an old military article she found months ago while researching Henry Montgomery. Turner had served in the same battalion as her grandfather. He was listed among the few who survived. Lila felt her throat tighten. Her grandmother's friend, the one who had returned alone, the man behind the music box. The rain deepened outside, drops racing down the glass like hurried thoughts. She stared at the letter again. The truth. Whatever it was, Evelyn had never spoken of it. She wondered if her grandmother had even seen this letter at all, or if it had been hiding all these years, waiting for someone else to open it. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into a new envelope. Her reflection in the window looked older, her eyes darker than she remembered. Somewhere deep down, she could feel the beginning of something shifting, a quiet untying of the past. She whispered into the still room, almost afraid of the sound of her own voice. "I think I know who you were. And tomorrow, I'm going to find out what you couldn't say." The next morning was pale and cold, the kind of gray that made the world feel half awake. Lila wrapped a scarf around her neck and headed into town. The rain had stopped, but puddles still clung to the sidewalks, reflecting the skeletons of bare trees. She carried the envelope in her coat pocket, feeling its fragile weight with every step. The town library sat on the corner of Willow and Main, a squat brick building with tall windows and the faint smell of old paper. It was the same place Evelyn had brought her as a child to check out storybooks. Now, walking through the double doors, Lila felt the same hush of reverence she had felt then, except this time it wasn't wonder that filled her, but a quiet urgency. She approached the front desk. An older man with a cardigan and glasses looked up from a stack of catalog cards. "I'm looking for military records," she said, "from the 1940s. His brows lifted slightly. "We still keep some of those in the back," he said. "What's the name?" "Michael Turner," she replied. He nodded and disappeared behind a swinging door. While waiting, she wandered between the rows of shelves, fingers brushing the spines of history books, letters, diaries. There was something sacred about this place, a warehouse of unfinished conversations. When the librarian returned, he carried a slim file folder. "Turner, Michael J.," he said, laying it on the counter. "Served 1943 to 1946, Army Postal Division." That meant he handled mail on the front lines, letters from men who might not live long enough to send another. Lila's pulse quickened. That matched the story. He would have been the one to carry Henry's final letter home. She opened the folder carefully. Inside were a few yellowed pages, a service card, an enlistment photo, and a single line typed at the bottom: "Residence after discharge, Boston, Massachusetts." That was her grandmother's city. The librarian leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You know, I think he stayed around here after the war. There's a note from a local address, a boarding house on Cedar Street." Lila wrote it down quickly. "Is there anything about family?" The man shook his head. "Nothing here. But if you're tracing him, check the Veterans Archive at the county office. They might have pension records." "Thank you," she said softly. When she stepped back outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves tumbled across the wet pavement. She pulled the letter from her pocket and looked at the words again. "You deserved the truth." Maybe he had written it here, in this town, decades ago, a letter he never sent. Later that afternoon, she drove to the county office. The woman behind the desk scanned her list and nodded. "Turner, Michael, deceased, died in 1998, no next of kin." "Do you have an address?" Lila asked. The woman squinted at the screen, then scribbled something on a sticky note. "It's been empty for years, but the place still stands." Lila drove there before the light disappeared. The address led her to the edge of town, where the houses grew smaller and the streets narrower. At the end of Cedar Lane stood a small wooden cottage, shutters closed, paint peeling in long white strips. The mailbox by the gate was rusted, the name barely legible, but it was there. M. Turner. Her heart thudded once, slow and heavy. She stood at the gate for a long time, unsure whether to knock, to call out, or to turn back. The wind moved through the branches overhead, making them creak softly, a sound almost like a sigh. She took a deep breath. The letter was still in her pocket, warm from her hand. Whatever truth had been buried with Michael Turner, it was about to find its way back into the light. The front porch sagged under Lila's weight as she climbed the steps. The wooden boards groaned like old bones, but the house stood steady. Through the window, she could see nothing but darkness and a thin film of dust on the glass. She hesitated before knocking, her knuckles hovering an inch from the wood. The door opened before she touched it. A woman in her 70s stood there, gray hair pulled into a bun, wearing a cardigan that hung loose on her frame. "You must be Evelyn's granddaughter," she said before Lila could speak. Her voice was soft but sure, the voice of someone who remembered things long after others forgot. Lila blinked. "How did you?" The woman smiled faintly. "He talked about her sometimes, near the end. Not much, but enough. My name's Mrs. Green. I live next door. I looked after him." "Michael Turner." Mrs. Green nodded. "Poor man. Kind eyes, but he carried something heavy." She stepped aside, gesturing Lila in. The air inside smelled of cedar and thyme. The furniture was simple, everything neat and untouched, as though waiting for a return that never came. "He didn't have family," Mrs. Green said, following her into the hallway. "After he passed, no one came for his things. There's a box up in the attic he kept locked. You can take a look if you think it matters." They climbed the narrow stairs together. The attic door creaked open to reveal a small space lined with rafters and shafts of light cutting through the dust. A single trunk sat in the corner, its metal latches dull with age. Mrs. Green handed her a small key. "I think he meant for someone to find it," she said quietly. Then she turned and descended the stairs, leaving Lila alone. Lila knelt by the trunk. The key fit perfectly. When she lifted the lid, a breath of stale air escaped, carrying the scent of paper and faint tobacco. Inside were photographs, envelopes tied with ribbon, and a leather-bound notebook. She sifted through them one by one. Most were war photos, soldiers smiling at campfires, faces half turned to the camera, a world frozen in sepia. Then she saw her grandmother. Evelyn stood in the center of a field, her dress fluttering, eyes bright, looking not at the camera, but at whoever held it. On the back, written in a clean script, "Taken by M, 1946. Lila's breath caught. Beneath the photo lay a folded piece of sheet music. The title read, "For E, the song that should have played." Her pulse quickened. The same melody from the music box. The handwriting was Michael's. Her fingers trembled as she turned the page. Notes covered the staff lines, neat and deliberate, ending with one final phrase scrawled in the margin. "He wrote the melody, but I finished it. Forgive me." The attic felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Dust drifted through the light like suspended ash. She could hear her heartbeat louder than the ticking of the house. At the bottom of the trunk was another envelope, its paper fragile, nearly translucent. Across the front were 3 words that matched the letter she'd found in the frame. "You deserved the truth." This one, though, was unsealed. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a single page covered in that same careful handwriting. The first line stopped her breath. Henry did not die that day. She froze. Her eyes moved to the next line. He was wounded. He asked me to tell her he loved her, but I couldn't. Her vision blurred. Because I loved her too. The paper slipped from her hands. For a long moment, she stayed still, the words echoing in the hollow of the attic. Outside, the wind sighed against the roof. The truth had finally surfaced, and it had waited 70 years for someone brave enough to read it. The attic felt colder after she read it, as if the air itself had stepped back from what she now knew. Lila sat on the wooden floorboards, the letter spread across her knees. The words swam before her eyes, the ink pale but stubborn, refusing to fade. Henry did not die that day. He was wounded. I tried, but I couldn't, because I loved her too. The 4 sentences circled her like ghosts, each carrying a different kind of sorrow. She looked again at the photograph of Evelyn, taken by Michael. Her grandmother's smile, open and bright, suddenly seemed heavier. Lila had always imagined her grandparents' love as something simple and steady, a story told in warm tones. But nothing about this letter was simple. It was full of contradiction, loyalty and betrayal, love and silence, woven into the same thread. She reached for the leather notebook from the trunk. The pages were filled with sketches of faces, brief lines of thought, music notations written in margins. Near the back, she found a draft of the same letter, written again and again in different versions. Each one began the same way. "Evelyn, I owe you the truth." But none of them were signed. Each ended in hesitation, the words trailing off mid-sentence, as if he could never find the courage to finish. Lila turned to the last page. There, in smaller writing, were lines that broke her heart. "I have carried his words and mine for too long. The silence became easier than honesty. If you ever read this, know that the song was his way of saying goodbye, and mine was an apology." Her eyes blurred. She realized Michael had spent the rest of his life building this quiet shrine of guilt, music, photographs, unsent letters, while her grandmother had lived beside that same silence, refusing to play the song because she already knew what it meant. And yet, neither had spoken. They had both chosen to protect Henry's memory, and in doing so, imprisoned themselves in it. Lila folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. Her hands trembled as she did. The truth she had uncovered wasn't cruel. It was human, complicated, fragile, and achingly real. For the first time, she felt she understood her grandmother's quiet, the way she could look out a window for hours without saying a word. Evelyn hadn't been lost in grief. She'd been listening to something that could never be played out loud. Lila gathered the photos and letters back into the trunk, each movement slow and deliberate, as though tucking the past back into its bed. But she kept one thing out, the sheet music titled For E, the song that should have played. She looked at the notes and could almost hear the melody forming in her head, fragile but complete. When she finally left the attic, she paused at the top of the stairs and looked back. The beam of sunlight had shifted across the floor, illuminating the open trunk. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow move beside it, not threatening, just watchful. She whispered into the stillness, her voice barely above a breath. "He told her he loved her, Grandma, and he loved you too. Maybe that's why it took 2 songs to say goodbye." The floor creaked softly, the sound almost like a sigh of agreement. Lila closed the attic door behind her. In her pocket, the folded sheet music seemed to hum against her palm, waiting patiently for its turn to be heard. The night air outside the old house was cold enough to make her breath visible, but Lila needed it. She walked out onto the porch, clutching the letter in one hand and the sheet music in the other. The world around her was quiet, except for the soft hiss of wind through the trees. The words she had just read echoed again and again inside her head. He did not die that day. He was wounded, because I loved her too. She whispered them once, just to hear how they sounded in her own voice. Saying them out loud made the weight of them real and somehow lighter. She looked up at the stars barely visible behind the clouds. Somewhere beneath that same sky, decades ago, 3 people had been bound together by love and silence. Henry had written his last words, Michael had carried them home, and Evelyn had chosen not to read them. 3 decisions, each born from love, each leaving a scar. Lila sat on the porch steps, the wood damp beneath her. She tried to imagine what it must have been like for Michael, to survive when your best friend didn't, to deliver the last words of a dying man to the woman you love, and then to spend the rest of your life living beside the echo of that silence. She unfolded the letter once more and read the final lines again. The silence became easier than honesty. The song was his way of saying goodbye, and mine was an apology. She closed her eyes and felt the wind against her face. For the first time, she understood that the truth didn't have to destroy what her grandmother had believed in. It only completed it. The love Evelyn and Henry shared hadn't been diminished by Michael's confession. It had simply existed in a world that was far more complicated than Lila had been told. Inside the house, the floorboards creaked. It was just the settling of wood and age, but it made her glance toward the open door. The smell of old paper and cedar drifted out. She thought of her grandmother sitting at her writing desk, pen in hand, staring at a blank page she never filled. "You knew, didn't you?" she said quietly. "You knew and forgave him anyway." She rose and went back inside. The house felt softer somehow, less haunted. On the table lay the music box she had brought with her months ago, the one that had started this whole journey. She placed the sheet music beside it, the two fitting together as if they had been waiting for each other all this time. Lila opened her notebook and began to write. Not about the war or the love triangle or the tragedy, but about forgiveness, how it lives quietly between the notes of a song, how it can stretch across decades and still find its way home. By the time she finished, the first light of dawn had begun to rise, painting the walls in pale gold. She looked down at what she had written and realized her hands were no longer shaking. Forgiveness wasn't about choosing between truth and love. It was about accepting that they had always belonged to the same story. Lila folded the letter one last time and set it inside the music box. She wound it once, then stopped just before it began to play. The silence that followed felt full, like an answer. She whispered into the still air, "It's all right now." Then, for the first time, she believed it. The next evening, the house felt different. The air seemed lighter, as if something invisible had finally been lifted. Lila moved through each room slowly, her footsteps soft on the old wooden floors. She had spent the day sorting through Michael's things, setting aside the letters and photos she planned to donate to the local archive. But one object she couldn't part with rested now on her grandmother's old desk, the music box. She sat down in Evelyn's chair, the leather cracked but comforting. The letter was tucked safely inside the box, folded neatly like a peace offering between two lives that had never truly separated. Lila traced her fingers over the lid. The engraving had grown faint, but she could still read the words beneath her touch. "Play this when you miss me." For months, she had feared this very moment, winding the box again. The first time she did, it had opened a door to secrets, but now she felt ready. She turned the crank slowly. The mechanism groaned once, then began to move. The familiar melody filled the room, steady and clear. Yet there was something new about it, a note she had never noticed before. It lingered near the end, softer than the rest, almost like a sigh. Lila leaned closer, her eyes closed. The music wrapped around her, and in that moment she could see them both, Evelyn and Michael, young, standing under the same gray sky that had followed them home from the war. She could see Evelyn's trembling hands as Michael gave her the box, and the sadness in his eyes as he told her what he couldn't bear to say aloud. Lila opened her eyes, tears already sliding down her cheeks. She whispered, "I forgive you." The words came out steady, though her voice broke halfway through. It wasn't only for Michael, it was for her grandmother too, and for Henry, and for the silence that had tied them all together. The melody reached its end and stopped with a small, delicate click. The room fell silent again, but this silence didn't hurt. It felt sacred. It felt whole. She turned on her camera. The small red light blinked to life. For the first time since starting Voice of Lila's, she didn't have a script. She just spoke. "I found a letter today," she said quietly, her tone gentle, as if she were telling a bedtime story. "It wasn't addressed to anyone, but I think it found who it was meant for." She paused, listening to her heartbeat. It said, "You deserved the truth." And maybe that's what we're all waiting for. Not just the truth about what happened, but the truth about why we loved the way we did. Sometimes we hide love inside silence, thinking we're protecting it, but maybe love just wants to be heard, even when it trembles. Her voice softened. "Tonight, I played their song again, and I swear I could hear them, not as ghosts, but as echoes of forgiveness." She reached forward and stopped the recording. The red light faded. For a while, she sat there in the dark, the stillness around her deep but kind. Then, from somewhere inside the music box, a faint mechanical sound clicked again, once, twice, and the final note played on its own, quiet and clear. Lila smiled through her tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "all of you." Morning light spilled through the curtains, soft and golden, the kind of light that made even dust look alive. The house was quiet again, but not in that aching way it used to be. It felt peaceful, like everything inside had finally exhaled. Then, from somewhere inside the music box, a faint mechanical sound clicked again, once, twice, and the final note played on its own, quiet and clear. Lila smiled through her tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "all of you." Morning light spilled through the curtains, soft and golden, the kind of light that made even dust look alive. The house was quiet again, but not in that aching way it used to be. It felt peaceful, like everything inside had finally exhaled. Lila packed her bag slowly, careful not to forget anything. The letter, Michael's letter, rested inside a small envelope she had sealed herself. She wasn't sure where it truly belonged, but something inside told her it needed to be released, not kept. She drove until the town gave way to open fields and the air grew saltier. The road curved toward a small lake lined with birch trees. It was a place her grandmother had loved, the spot where she used to feed ducks on quiet mornings. The surface of the water shimmered in the light, rippling softly like music played in slow motion. Lila stepped out of the car and walked toward the shore. The envelope was warm in her hands. She stood there for a long moment, feeling the pull of everything that had led her here. The photo, the note, the attic, the truths that had waited 70 years to be read. She thought of Michael, the man who carried another man's love and his own guilt across an ocean. Of Henry, who wrote a song instead of a goodbye. Of Evelyn, who chose silence, perhaps not from fear, but from mercy. And of herself, the granddaughter who had inherited the weight of unfinished stories and somehow found the courage to listen. She knelt by the edge of the lake. The water reflected her face and the pale sky behind her. She whispered, "This was never about secrets. It was about love, the kind that survives even when no one is left to hear it." She set the letter gently on the surface of the water. For a second it floated, trembling, before the current caught it. The paper darkened, curling at the edges as it drifted away. Lila watched it until it vanished, a single ripple spreading outward, then fading. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the music box one last time. The metal crank gleamed faintly in the sunlight. She wound it just enough for a few notes to play. The melody Michael had finished, the song Henry had begun. The tune was faint, almost lost beneath the wind, but she could hear it. And for a moment, it felt like 3 hearts were breathing together again, one forgiving, one remembering, one letting go. When the song ended, Lila closed the lid and held it against her chest. The silence that followed was gentle, filled not with absence, but with peace. As she stood, she looked toward the horizon where the water met the sky and said quietly, "It's all sent now. Every word." She walked back to her car, her reflection following in the ripples beside her. Before getting in, she looked back one more time, smiling through the mist of her own tears. "This is Voice of Lila's," she whispered, "where memories whisper and hearts remember." The camera in her car blinked red as it started recording, capturing her final shot. The lake behind her, the music box in her hands, and the faint sound of wind carrying the last note away. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still keeps their own letter unspoken. Subscribe to Voice of Lila's, where every memory finds its way home. Days turned into weeks, and life around Lila's world began to quiet again. But something inside her had shifted for good. The house no longer felt like a museum of someone else's life. It breathed again, warm and awake, carrying traces of laughter and the faint echo of an old melody. Her video about the letter had gone live 3 nights ago. She hadn't expected much. It was only her voice, soft and unpolished, reading fragments of the letter and speaking about forgiveness. But somehow it had found its way into thousands of hearts. Comments poured in, stories of lost love, apologies never sent, words people wished they had said. Lila read each one slowly, her chest swelling with something she couldn't name. It wasn't fame she felt, it was connection. Each message was a reminder that her grandmother's silence wasn't unique, that so many hearts had lived between love and truth, too afraid to let either go. And now, through her voice, Evelyn's story was helping others find their own endings. That night, Lila sat by the window with the music box open beside her. She didn't wind it. She didn't need to. The song had already done what it came to do. On the desk nearby lay her next project, a small notebook filled with titles and ideas for future stories. The first one at the top of the page read, "The Window That Never Opened Again." She smiled. The stories weren't just about her grandmother anymore. They were about everyone who had ever held on to something they were finally ready to release. She poured herself a cup of tea, steam curling through the air like memory. The faint smell of jasmine drifted from the scarf still hanging on the back of the chair. Evelyn's scarf. She hadn't been able to wash it. She didn't plan to. Some things were meant to linger. She whispered, "I hope you're listening, Grandma. I think you'd like what your story became." The floor creaked softly, the way it always did when the wind passed through the chimney. Lila smiled. "I'll take that as a yes." She picked up her phone and started recording a short message for her viewers. "Sometimes," she began, her tone calm and steady, "truth doesn't arrive when we expect it. It takes the long way, through people, through years, through silence. But when it finally finds us, it doesn't break us. It frees us." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the music box. "I used to think forgiveness was about forgetting," she said. "Now I know it's about remembering, honestly and without fear." She stopped recording. The video would post in the morning. Before heading to bed, she wound the music box one last time. The melody filled the quiet room, soft as breath, gentle as a good night. The sound rose and fell, then ended on the same note it always did, one that hung in the air just long enough to feel like a promise. Lila closed the lid and whispered, "Thank you for everything you didn't say." The house seemed to sigh in return. Outside, the wind carried the melody through the trees, blending it with the hum of the night, a song not of grief anymore, but of peace. If this story found you tonight, let it stay a while. Share it with someone whose truth still waits to be heard. Subscribe to Voice of Lila's, where memories whisper and hearts remember.